in the great Orthodox nations, Russia, Serbia, Romania, Greece, etc., there are monasteries, many monasteries. A place like Russia, literally thousands, for men and for women. In the male monasteries, where the men are, the monks, they're usually very well endowed with priests and others who can accomplish the sacraments, confession and the liturgy, etc. But for the women, it's usually travelling priests or something to that effect. Perhaps a priest lives somewhere close to the monastery to see to the needs of the monastic women. And so it is that a priest comes to one of these women monasteries and the nuns line up for revelation of thoughts and confession. And one of the nuns begins and she starts telling him about her problems and whatever. The priest listens and listens carefully. But after she finishes, he says to her, "You mentioned nothing about any sort of fleshly problems, any desires or anything like that." And she smiles and says, "Oh, I have overcome all that. With God's help, I have overcome that. I've freed myself from all those particular desires, and I thank God for all that." And this priest, who is a very great spiritual father, says to her, "Well, that's very good to hear. Tomorrow is the weekday again, all the shops will be open. I want you to do something." She says, "What? What do you want me to do?" "Just remove all your clothes and go to the main street shopping." She says, "What? What are you saying to me? What sort of thing is this that you're telling me? What kind of ridiculous thing is this?" She said, "But you just said you've been freed of all those passions and the tyranny of the flesh." She said, "But I can't do that." I said, "Why not? Adam and Eve lived like that. They were freed of it. Why can't you do it? If you're free of it, that means you should be already like Adam and Eve before they fell." She said, I see. In other words, I'm not freed at all." So now you've got the point. Now you understand. Why am I saying this? Because on this particular feast day, we bring forth the other aspect about the preparation for us to obtain that state of Adam before the fall. We've heard of Saint Gregory Palamas and the acquisition of uncreated light and the sort of systematic approach to spiritual life from Saint John of the Ladder. And now we come to Saint Mary of Egypt. She was not, like some people think, a harlot. She was basically captured, completely addicted to pleasures of the flesh, and even paid men. And having once seen a crowd on a feast day of the cross go into the temple, she had some inspiration to enter as well. But a force stopped her, couldn't go in. That moment she realised, why? And prayed, Mother of God. That force that stopped her was released, and she managed to go in and pray. And she promised to the Mother of God that if she could be saved, she would go and live in the desert to struggle against all these passions that were bothering her. To fulfill her promise, she took a few loaves of bread and ran into the Egyptian desert, living there for many decades, actually 40 years, with the most horrendous trials, especially initially, because there was nothing to comfort her, and she was living there for the first while as if dead, lying on the ground and begging God to help her be freed from the passions that were tyrannizing her body and soul. The clothes that she wore were, of course, ripped to shreds and gone. Her hair became white and grew all over her and covered her, and she continued to live on those few loaves of bread that she took with her then for all those decades. One day, a priest called Zosima happened to be passing through this desert. Noticed this creature in the distance. He became somewhat startled because he didn't know what it was, until she called out to him, Father Zosima, prophetic. He, of course, became startled but curious about who this person would have been. And they entered into a very long conversation, and she related to him the trials that she went through in this life of hers, living in the desert, going through all those extremely ascetic acts to overcome the fallen nature and to rise above it. And although she was naked, but covered with all the hair that grew all over her and from her head, she was able to relate all this. Zosima promised to come back in a year and give her communion, which he did. He found her after the year on the other side of the Jordan River. She walked on the water and came to him to have the communion, and promised again to come back a year later, which he did. And when he did, he saw her lying dead, and he had a piece of wood where he tried to bury her and did the services, but the ground was too hard, until a lion came around and helped him dig the grave and buried her. The details I want you to fill in yourself from the life of St. Mary of Egypt, because her act shows us the requirement, the next requirement in obtaining that Christ-likeness and that state before Adam fell, of the ascetic life, the shedding of anything that holds us back and attaches us to this world, to the passions, whether they be emotional, physical, material, or in any way. And she becomes one whose detail we know very much about how she went about that, and is an example to all those who struggle against these sort of things. That there will be times when it is extremely hard to overcome these things. As I've said to you on other occasions, the important thing is never to give up, not to relinquish that struggle, because even if we don't actually come anywhere near her status, and most of us never will, it's the struggle that God rewards. And without that struggle, one gets nowhere. If one just gives up, just lives a life, a sinful life, when I say sinful, I mean loose, not caring about keeping the commandments in body, mind, and soul, because all those three faculties in us are subject to the tyranny of the fallen nature. It doesn't mean that we are sinners like that, but we have a propensity for that in our lives on account of that tyranny. And until the great resurrection and the rebuilding of our bodies in the new form, the incorruptible and eternal form, we have to be careful about that in our lives, because like this nun who thought she had already made it, realised that she was nowhere near it, actually. Nowhere near it. That to her, the tyranny was still there, but just her pride and her vanity, because she did a lot of things in her struggle, she thought that she'd already conquered that fleshly desire or whatever, but she did not. She did not. And that often goes to us too, because we work on something spiritually in ourselves and we think, aha, I've managed to overcome that. And weeks pass, days pass. Then all of a sudden there's some trip up that we unexpectedly encounter which brings us down again. And we realise that, no, we haven't actually conquered anything. We might have subdued it for a while, but it still lives within us, lives within our fallen nature. And that fallen nature is the whole thing that Christ came to fix for us on earth through the new covenant, to restore us back to the state of Adam before the fall. As Saint Athanasius the Great says, and I've repeated this many times, God became a man forever, so that we could become gods by grace. We can become Christ-like. We can shed all the desires and fallenness that tyrannizes us and leads to death. The reading that we had today, the Accompanies to the Mother of God, was the one that was nominated to be read this week, and also the Canon of St. Andrew the Crib, followed by the life of St. Mary of Egypt. So in that service, the Great Compline, which goes for about 3 hours, that whole thing is performed on that particular week, the Great Lent. We are now in the 5th Sunday, and next week, Great Lent finishes with the entry of the Lord into Jerusalem, the conquering of and the completion of all that he came to do. Leaving Holy Week, special period, considered not part of Great Lent, but a special week in itself, being the time when Christ's passion comes about, and crucifixion and resurrection on the week after. So we've only got those 2 weeks to go. Make the most of them in this period, and if you haven't worked enough upon yourself, at least during these 2 weeks, make that effort. God help us with this struggle, and may we indeed be